Ever imagine a company kind of quietly working on projects so huge they're practically shaping a nation's energy, you know, landscape?
Yeah.
We're talking about Engineers India Ltd, EIL for short. And today we're going deep dive into their Q2 FY25 financials.
Right.
Now, whether you're, maybe thinking about investing or just curious about all the stuff that goes into building India's infrastructure,
hmm
this deep dive, it's for you.
It really is fascinating because EIL, they're not just like putting up buildings, they're designing and managing these intricate projects. Oil refineries, fertilizer plants,
Huge scale.
contributing to India's energy independence, the whole thing.
Yeah, and to kind of unravel this story, right? We've got EIL's standalone and consolidated financial reports. We got the auditor's limited review, and we even snagged their investor presentation.
Nice.
So we're on a mission here. Is EIL a stock to watch?
That's the question.
What are they doing well? What are their challenges? And what does all this mean for their future?
Exactly. And we're going to be looking at these documents, not just for what happened in Q2, but like, why did it happen? What does this tell us about where EIL is going?
Okay, so first up, big picture, overall performance. EIL saw like a dip in revenue this quarter compared to last year, BUT. And this is interesting. Their half-year figures are actually UP.
Yeah, and this is where the difference between EIL's two main segments, consultancy and turnkey projects, that's where it gets really important. This quarter's dip, mainly it's because of the turnkey side of things.
Okay, so for our listener who might not be, deep in this world, break down this consultancy versus turnkey thing.
Okay, so think of it like this. Consultancy, they're giving advice, expert advice, they're designing services. That part's been pretty steady, even growing a bit if you look at the reports. Turnkey, or what they call lump sum turnkey, LSTK, it's a mouthful. But basically, EIL manages the whole project.
Wow.
From the design all the way to handing over the keys when it's done.
So it's like, I don't know, a baker who's selling individual cookies. That's steady, right? But then sometimes they get an order for a giant wedding cake.
Exactly. And the wedding cakes, those turnkey projects, they bring in the big bucks, but they don't happen all the time. So, when one finishes, you might see a dip, like this quarter, even if the whole bakery's doing great.
Right. Makes sense. And those long-term contracts, it's not like they get all the money at once. It's spread out over time.
Exactly. Revenue recognition, they call it. Happens gradually.
Okay, so revenue dipped. BOUT, EIL's PAT, their profit after tax, that's still looking pretty healthy. 1.41 earnings per share for the quarter. Investors are probably pretty happy about that.
Yeah, and it's important to keep in mind, with the turnkey projects especially, we really need to look at the whole financial year to judge how profitable they are. Because remember, the margins, they're recognized over the whole project's life, not just at the end.
Oh, right. That makes sense. Hey, speaking of profitability, remember that bump EIL got a while back, settling that dispute with a client on a past turnkey project?
Yeah, it was pretty significant, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it shows they're willing to fight to get what they're owed. Good sign for investors. Shows they're serious about protecting their bottom line.
Makes sense. Okay, let's move on to new business. What's coming down the pipeline? What's in their order book? And EIL, they snagged a lot of new business both in India and overseas, especially back in Q1 FY25.
This order book, it's a really good sign, strong indicator of future growth, Even if one quarter is a bit slow on the turnkey side, they've got plenty lined up to keep the revenue coming in.
And we're talking about some impressive projects here, right? There's a demo bio ATF unit for a refinery. Yeah. Redevelopment of residential properties for ONGC. That's, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, the big guy in Indian energy.
Right.
And they even got a green ammonia project over in Oman.
Yeah, and those diverse projects, that green ammonia one in particular, it really shows EIL's potential to adapt and thrive. This renewable energy sector, it's booming, not just in India, globally. And they're right there in the mix. Okay, before we go too far, let's peek at their balance sheet for a sec. One thing that pops out, their cash position is really healthy. 648.64 crores, even after all these investments they're making. That's got to be a good sign, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Looking closer, we see their trade receivables have gone up this quarter, probably because of those big turnkey projects, timing of payments and all that. Something to keep an eye on, but it's not necessarily a bad thing at this point.
And for our listener who might be wondering about the auditor's limited review, this is like standard procedure for quarterly reports, not as deep as a full audit, but still gives some assurance, right?
Yeah, think of it as a quick checkup just to make sure everything seems to be in order. We'll get the full workup of the annual audit later.
Okay, cool. Now let's switch gears a bit. EIL, they're not just doing projects for others, they're putting their money where their mouth is, right? Making capital investments.
They're positioning themselves really strategically, right in line with the big trends that are shaping India's future, especially this push for self-reliance.
Like a perfect example is that 26% stake they have in the Ramagundam fertilizer project. This thing is massive. It's a huge part of India's plan to produce all its own fertilizer.
Huge.
And they're not stopping there. They're upping their stake in Numaligarh refinery too. They're in the energy game for the long haul.
These investments, they fit right in with India's national strategy, boost domestic production, rely less on imports, especially for critical stuff, energy, agriculture, EIL. They're not just watching this happen, they're profiting from it.
So as India grows, EIL is positioned to grow right alongside it. Pretty smart. Back again for more of our deep dive into Engineers India Limited. In part one, we found some pretty interesting stuff about how they did this quarter, but there's like a whole lot more to uncover.
Oh yeah, tons. And, got to highlight that strong cash position again. Even with all those investments, their consolidated cash and cash equivalents, it's a whopping 648.64 crores.
That's seriously impressive, especially when you think about the money they're putting into those strategic investments, right? The ones we talked about. Really shows they know how to manage their cash flow.
Exactly, exactly. And if we dig into the cash flow statement, we see a big chunk of their cash outflow. From investing, it went into fixed deposits with banks, specifically the kind that matured after 3 months. But they also had a lot of inflow from fixed deposits that did mature. So it's a pretty balanced flow.
Okay, so they're like juggling, right?
Yeah.
Investing for the future, but also making sure they have enough cash on hand for, day-to-day operations.
Precisely.
Yeah.
This is smart financial management, key to their overall health, financially speaking. Now, let's turn our attention to that order book. We already said it's a really good indicator of where the revenue's going.
Right.
And right now it's sitting pretty at, get this, 1,011,553 million consolidated.
Wow. And if we break that down by segment, consultancy's bringing in 64,957 million of that. And turnkey projects, they're holding a hefty 46,596 million. And what's really interesting, this isn't just stuff in India, it's a good mix of domestic and overseas projects, isn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. In fact, if we get into the nitty-gritty, consultancy, 86% of that order book is from domestic projects, but there's a solid 12% from overseas ventures. Turnkey, it's a little different, 61% domestic, but a big 39% from international clients. This kind of diversification, it helps them, one region's economy isn't doing so hot, they're not putting all their eggs in one basket.
Smart. Okay, now about those overseas projects, the one in Oman, the green ammonia one, we mentioned it before. What makes that one so special?
So EIL, they're providing consultancy services for the offshore part of this project. It's ACME Group's 300 MTPD green ammonia project in Oman. And what's really fascinating here is it puts EIL right in the middle of this global shift, right, toward renewable energy, shows they have the potential to be a major player in this market, which is just getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, yeah. And they're not just in Oman. Internationally, they're working with some big names like Kuwait National Petroleum Company, ADNOC offshore in the UAE. And their work, it's pretty varied. Consultancy for energy efficiency improvements, feed development, project management for all sorts of upstream and downstream facilities.
This international stuff, it's not just about more revenue. It shows the world, what EIL can do. Top-notch technical expertise, competing on the global stage, strengthens their brand, opens up even more opportunities. The global energy market, it's dynamic, it's exciting, and EIL is right there.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears again, look at the breakdown of their revenue by segment. For the half year ending September 30th, 2024, consultancy brought in 7,295.05 million, turnkey 5,575.52 million. What do you make of that?
Well, what jumps out to me is that even though turnkey revenue dipped in Q2, it's still a big chunk of EIL's overall revenue. This just goes to show, we got to remember how turnkey works. It's cyclical. It's like those wedding cakes we talked about, right? If they delivered a big one last year, this year's numbers might look different.
Right, right. Big impact when they deliver, but there's going to be quieter periods in between those big deliveries.
Exactly. So we got to look beyond just one quarter,
Yeah.
Think about the whole financial year when we judge how EIL's doing. And don't forget that order book, all those projects lined up, that suggests they've got a lot more turnkey revenue coming in the future.
Okay, good point. Now let's address something some listeners might be worried about. EIL's standalone financials, they show a decrease in profit before tax PBT in Q2 FY25 compared to last year. How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, it's definitely something to acknowledge, but context is key here. That decrease, it's mostly because of how the turnkey business works. The lumpiness. A big project finishing up last year can make a difference.
So, given all the projects in their order book, this might just be a blip, not a real trend.
Exactly. Plus, their consultancy segment, it's still growing steadily. And we can't forget all the new business they won, especially back in Q1 FY25. That's all going to contribute to their revenue in the coming quarters.
Great point. And that's a great place to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive. We've looked at EILs, their cash position, which is strong, their order book, diversified across the globe, and those really interesting projects they've got going on overseas.
We also dug into how their revenue breaks down by segment and talked about that dip in Q2 PBT. Coming up in the final part, we'll be talking about EIL's future and what it all means for you, our listener. Stick with us.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Engineers India Ltd. We've really gone through their financials, seen all these amazing projects they've got going on, and now I guess the big question is what does it all mean?
Right. This is where we kind of put it all together, give you some, actionable insights. Remember those capital investments EIL's making?
Yeah.
They're not just like throwing darts at a board. These are strategic moves tied to these larger trends that are shaping India's economy. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The Ramagundam fertilizer project, that's a perfect example. Huge project. And their 26% stake, it shows they're serious about this whole self-reliance thing.
And what's really cool about this project is it's not just about profits for EIL. It's actually making a difference in people's lives, millions of people in India. It's directly contributing to the nation's food security.
Yeah.
Fertilizers, they're essential for agriculture, right? And if India can produce its own, it doesn't have to rely on imports so much, which can be, unpredictable, prices going up and down, supply chain issues, all that.
Yeah, makes sense. It's good for EIL and it's good for India. Win-win. And then there's that investment in New Malagar refinery, again, tapping into that push for energy independence.
And this brings up a really important question, especially for our listeners who are, thinking about the big picture. How is EIL going to handle this global shift towards renewable energy? They're pretty heavily invested in, the traditional energy sector, so how adaptable they are, that's something to watch closely.
It's like they're riding two waves at the same time. The need for oil and gas, that's not going away anytime soon. But then there's this long-term trend moving towards cleaner energy, more sustainable sources. And their investor presentation, it doesn't really talk about this much. So it's kind of like a blind spot for us.
Yeah, their next moves in this area, that's going to be really telling. Will they use their expertise, jump into the renewable energy market more aggressively? Could they become a leader in green technology solutions for refineries? These are big questions for investors to think about, especially if they're looking at EIL for the long term.
Okay, so big picture for our listener. What are the key takeaways from all this, from our deep dive into EIL?
Well, EIL, they're a solid company financially. They've got a proven track record doing these really complex engineering projects. Yeah, their Q2 revenue dipped a bit, but that's probably because of how the turnkey business works, those cycles we talked about. Doesn't mean there's something fundamentally wrong.
Right. And that massive order book, all those projects lined up, that's got to be a good sign for future revenue. Plus, the investments they're making, they're in a great position to benefit from India's focus on, making things domestically.
Exactly. But we got to remember, the energy world, it's changing fast.
Yeah.
How well EIL adapts to this whole renewable energy thing, that's going to be crucial for their long-term success. It's the wild card, something to really consider if you're thinking about investing in EIL.
Really interesting stuff. And that wraps up our deep dive into EIL. Hope you learned something new, got some food for thought. Whether you're thinking about investing or just curious about, how India is building its future, remember, the learning doesn't stop here. Keep asking questions, stay informed, and keep diving deep into the world around you.